All right, we're running a little bit late, and that's because Katrina Blair was one person you don't want to stop. And that's my fault for not scheduling her for a whole hour. Next year, I promise you, she'll be doing an hour's talk. Wasn't that amazing? How many people really enjoyed that? You know, one of the things about the Tellluride Mushroom Festival is mushrooms are a world like mycelia that lead us out to other places. It's not just a narrow world of definitions, a lexicon of narrow vision. It's about expanding our consciousness through the help of the mushrooms. And so when we talk about wild plants, we're talking about the interaction between plants and mushrooms and wild harvesting and how important all that is. And I think that's why I think Katrina is really key to some of the things we're doing here. Well, another key has been Britt Bunyard. He's done a Fungi magazine. How many people are subscribers to Fungi? I know I am. I am so impressed. For many years I subscribed to Mushroom, which was kind of interesting, but it didn't have the energy. Fungi is just a great magazine. I'm so impressed, and I'm very proud that the Tellluride Mushroom Festival has formed an alliance, and Fungi is one of our sponsors. And so I asked Britt to give a lecture last year. It was really interesting. And this year, he's going to talk about Amanita Muscaria. I mean, Amanita is not Muscaria. All the Amanitas, different kinds, beyond Soma. So please welcome Britt Bunyard and Fungi Magazine.
All right, thanks, Art. That was great. So yeah, I'll be talking about different species of Amanita. If you're here to hear about Soma or entheogens or Muscaria use or anything like that, this talk is not going to be about that. But I think it'll be about some stuff that probably is just as important, if not more important to you. And I'll show you how to know you're eating Amanitas or not eating Amanitas and which species you have, etc. You know, if you see the quotes up here on the big screen from a couple of the most famous mycologists in North America, Charles McIlvaine, who wrote 1,000 American Fungi, and David Aurora, who you're probably all familiar with because of Mushrooms Demystified. You know, both of them point out that if you're going to be collecting mushrooms and eating them, for sure the first group you should start with to learn is the group of Amanitas, because this is the group that's the most dangerous and the most beautiful, but the most dangerous and leads to the most poisonings and serious poisonings every year. So hopefully, if you're here to hear about Soma and entheogens and stuff, I don't think you'll be disappointed. So just stay tuned. Besides, I'm pretty much the warm-up act for Gary Linkoff will be on after me, and I think you'll probably get plenty of discussion of entheogens. Okay, so first off, acknowledgments for who owns some of the pictures I'll be using in this talk. Probably at least half of the photos are my own, but I borrow photos from a lot of people that are much better photographers than me, including the fellow pictured right there, Michael Wood, who runs the MycoWeb website, which probably you're all familiar with, and if you're not, you should be, because it's a terrific site to learn about mushrooms and how to identify them, etc. And I know Mike's in the audience here. Some other slides came from Nathan Wilson, who started Mushroom Observer and is now, that's pretty much just gone totally out of control, and he's moved on to some other things. And Noah Siegel, Don Bryant, John Plischke III, and several others you see there. And Rod Tullis is pretty much the big poobah of Amanitas in North America. And his website has all the information. It's like the clearinghouse for all of the species and lots of pictures. And he's been very helpful to help me to learn Amanitas. I'm trying to learn more and more species right now for my own personal research, which involves bugs that live in mushrooms. And so he's been super helpful in trying to learn them. And as it turns out, it's pretty easy to know a lot of the Amanitas because they're big and showy and have parts that are pretty easy to see. So hopefully that'll come out in this talk. Okay, so why should you know the Amanitas and decide to try to learn them? There's lots of reasons, shown here on the screen. There's many species. Unlike a lot of other mushrooms, they're big and showy and pretty. They're in the news a lot. There's, of course, lots of lore and myths about Amanitas. Some of them are edible and even world-renowned for their edibility. Several are not just poisonous, but deadly poisonous and lead to deaths every year. And then there's some other odd things about them that a lot of other groups of mushrooms can't claim, like they've altered the course of world history before, and we'll discuss that and just a few minutes. There are invasive species, and like a lot of other fish and flowers and weeds and things, mushrooms can be invasive species, and we'll see an invasive species in just a couple minutes. Tied to global warming, so you see a lot of things in the news really apply to Amanitas. And besides that, they're beautiful, and they're everywhere. If you go to a mushroom festival or show, you're always going to see Amanitas. They're great big, everyone loves to see them, and they're colorful. So, lots of reasons to try to learn the Amanitas. Okay, so Charles McIlvaine, who I mentioned earlier, in his really famous book, 1,000 American Fungi, McIlvaine is famous for pretty much tasting every single mushroom that's in his book and living to tell about it. He said this about Amanitas: they are the aristocrats of fungi. They're noble-bearing, their beauty, their power for good over evil, or good or evil, and above all, their perfect structure have placed them first in their realm, and they proudly bear the 3 badges of their clan and rank: the vulva, or sheath from which they spring, the kid-like apron encircling their waists, and the patch marks of their high birth upon their caps. So, I mean, who wouldn't want to know more about Amanitas when you hear an introduction like that? So, here's where we'll begin. If you're coming in from the forays, this is probably going to describe what you're finding. You have your basket with the big boletes and the russulas and all these different colorful things that you can quickly take out, and you pretty much know what they are, and you can kind of start dividing them up into piles. And then you get down in the bottom of the basket, and there's all these white mushrooms, some of them with white gills, large base, a ring. Now what? You know some of them are probably Amanitas, maybe even dangerous to try to eat and cook up. Some of them are probably tasty. You probably have some agaricus in there, some lepiotas. But what do? Do you just throw caution to the wind and decide you're going to taste them all, or do you just throw them all out because you don't want to take any chances? Well, this talk is for you if this has happened to you. First, though, don't wait until this. Don't wait until they've been sitting on the table for a couple days to identify them, and they're all shriveled up and eaten by bugs, and then you really can't decide what you have. You have to be able to pretty much identify them right away when they're still fresh. And it's, again, pretty easy with Amanitas because they're large and they have pretty easily recognizable parts on them that you don't necessarily have to use a microscope to see. So in the picture on the left, which is from Tom Volk's website, shows some of the parts labeled on Amanitas. Of course, you see the cap, gills, and stem, and the annulus or the ring. But Amanitas have some other things that a lot of other mushrooms don't have. They often have a cup underneath, or a vulva underneath the stem at the base, which is part of what's called a universal veil that ensheaths the entire mushroom when it's getting started. And then they also have what's called a partial veil in many cases, which is sort of covering over the gills. So, and some Amanitas have both of those. So with all mushrooms, if you're really wanting to learn them, it's really not enough to take a knife and cut the stem and bring the cap and part of the stem in. You really, Amanitas especially, but with all mushrooms, you should really try to dig down underneath the entire mushroom and bring all of that in if you're wanting to identify it, because a lot of the information about the mushroom is down at the very bottom of the stipe. And with the Amanitas, if they have a vulva, it's very easy to pluck the mushroom out of there, and you won't even know if they had one or not, and now you really can't make a positive identification of which group of Amanitas you're talking about. If you see the picture on the right, I show that because it shows an immature Amanita mushroom, and before that was sliced in half, it looked very much like a puffball. And if you're one of those people that eats puffballs, which I frankly don't know why you would, because they have no flavor and there's lots of good mushrooms in the woods, but if you're one of those people that eats puffballs, you should be very cautious, because Amanitas, when they're very small and immature, they're in what some people call an egg form, and likewise some stinkhorns and some other probably inedible mushrooms do the same thing. But if you were to slice through it entirely, you would see a puffball, of course, is white throughout, and it's going to turn into spore-making tissue. An Amanita, since it's an actual stalked mushroom, it'll be fully formed in this little egg form, and you can see where the cap and the stem and some of the other structures are. So hopefully, if you do choose to eat puffballs, you're checking these once in a while, because you would not want to have a destroying angel button in with your puffballs, because you might be in for a surprise when you're waking up dead some morning. Speaking of which, waking up dead. Okay, so I will show some edible amanitas in the talk, and ones that are very famous for being edible in Europe as well as in the New World, and I've eaten them. But I want to caution, do not ever eat any mushroom unless you're absolutely certain. You know, people that take chances with mushrooms, there's just really no reason for it. They're tasty, but they're certainly not worth the risk of becoming violently ill or dead. So I'm not advocating anyone in here eating any amanitas unless you absolutely know for sure what you're eating. And you know, people ask me all the time, have you ever eaten a poisonous mushroom or had a scare or gotten really sick? And I say, no, not even close. Not once ever have I ever been sickened or you know, in the hospital or anything, because if I'm unsure of a mushroom, which is often, you know, I'm sure I'll be uncertain of lots of mushrooms here when I go around the tables. So I certainly wouldn't want to take a chance. So you shouldn't either. So you can see the little symbols there on the left. They'll guide you as to which groups are edible and which are not. But again, if you're going to decide to start tasting them, be absolutely certain of what you're sticking in your mouth. Okay, now that I've frightened you, I'll point out that despite the fact that people do get poisoned all the time, and people die every single year from eating mushrooms, it's pretty unlikely that you would eat a poisonous mushroom, because if you see at the top there, of all the species of fungi, you know, there's not a whole lot of fungi, frankly, that produce mushrooms. And of all the mushrooms that are going to be coming in at this event, you know, some are edible and actually palatable and tasty and are sought after. You know, there will be some poisonous ones on there, but the vast majority of all mushrooms are really somewhere in between. They're probably edible but not palatable. They're tough and woody, or they're bitter but not poisonous, or they're, you know, have some other distasteful component about them. Again, they're not poisonous, so technically they're edible, but you know, why would you bother with them? So in any case, the point is that if you collected every mushroom you found today up in the mountains and brought them down, it's fairly unlikely you would have any deadly ones, but at the same time, I guess except for this year with all the bullies, it's unlikely you'll have very many palatable ones as well. Okay, so the family Amanitaceae has 4 genera. I'm going to be talking about the genus Amanita only. The other 3 genera have very few species, and it's pretty unlikely you would encounter them. Some of them, like Amarindia and Torrindia, have species that look a lot like truffles and are underground, believe it or not. Mostly they don't occur in North America. Lemicella actually do produce stalked mushrooms, you know, with a cap and gills and these things, but only a couple species, and they're not terribly common, and they're very, very slimy, so you would probably not be too interested in picking them as well. The genus Amanita worldwide has lots of species, hundreds and hundreds, and so I'll be showing you lots today, and I'll be moving through quite a few pictures kind of quickly just to show you some of the really pretty ones in different groups and give you some factoids. It's not going to be a scientific discussion at all. This will be how you can identify species using pretty much just, you know, a field guidebook, holding it in your hand and looking at it. You're not going to need a lot of specialized equipment or even, frankly, a microscope. So hopefully that's good news for everybody. Okay, I put this slide in because there was some talk of mycorrhizal associations, and I think there's going to be another talk later today on mycorrhizal. Nearly all the Amanita species are mycorrhizal. Most guidebooks say that all of them are, and that's not actually true. So I just want to mention what mycorrhizal means. This is association with the roots of plants, especially trees in the case of Amanitas. And the fungus lives with the roots in association, does a lot of the business that we used to think the roots did, uptake of water and nutrients and stuff like that. And it turns out roots of plants, and especially trees, are not really very good at doing stuff like this. So they get basically parasitized by the fungus, which does this work for them much of the time. And likewise, the fungus then steals away or is given through the generosity of the plant, depending on the perspective of the human that's talking about them. Gets nutrients from the tree, photosynthate and stuff like this. You can see the picture of the Amanita in the drawing there, living way out around the drip line or even beyond of the tree. And if you know how to identify different trees, that's how you identify your different edible mushrooms, right? You know which trees to look for morels and boletes and things. And it's the same with Amanitas. If you're looking for particular Amanitas, you can often look for different tree hosts. So, okay, here's some factoids about Amanita. And you'll see the genus is separated there into two subgenera. They're all terrestrial, so you won't see them growing on rotting wood or anything like that. Nearly all are mycorrhizal. We'll see at least one that's not, which sometimes can lead to some people mistakenly eating it. They all have white spores, white gills, universal veil, which we mentioned, and the vulva. Many have this partial veil, which we'll see that in a number of the different groups. And then the two subgenera are separated from the genus by the factoids there in the box. In the subgenus Amanita, the spores are not amyloid. They do not develop a bluish-black color when an iodine-type stain is put on them. And I'll show you what that means in just one second. And then the other subgenus, Lepidella, the spores are amyloid, and I'll show how that works. And you can actually do that, without a microscope and see this reaction. Okay, so if you have this iodine solution, and you can even just use plain iodine if you want, called Melzer's reagent, you can make a spore print, and that's what you're looking at here in this big picture. It's a big spore print on a little glass slide, or you can use wax paper or a number of things. You can't use newsprint or something like that because that will actually react with iodine. You put the iodine on, the spores have starch in them, so they turn this dark blue-black color. If they are in amyloid or not amyloid, they'll just remain white and colorless. And if it's a closely related group, the Lepiotas, they are dextrinoid. They'll turn this reddish color, and you can see the little inset picture that shows the reddish-looking spores. So that's the use of Melzer's reagent. And you won't need that to do a lot of these, to identify a lot of these, so don't get too worked up. However, if you're with a mycological club out on a big 4A, someone will probably have these that you can see this reaction done in front of you. And I know down at the ID tents with Linnaea and some of the others, they have these reagents down there if you want to see how this works. And this is the non-amyloid or in-amyloid reaction. The spores just remain colorless, and the iodine was washed off and didn't subject them to a color change. You can sort of see along the left-hand half of the picture there, you can see where the gills were on this spore print. So, this is just, the mushroom was just placed right on the wax, I think that's probably wax paper. Okay, so besides knowing your Amanitas, know the lookalikes. Amanitaceae are easily confused with the Lepiotaceae, and poisonings happen all the time. And the reason they're confused is they're fairly closely related, so that's why they look a lot alike. Just remember that Amanitas, if you want to be absolutely certain, and you're the type that do spore prints, which you really should be if you want to make sure of all mushrooms you're picking, you should do spore prints. They have the amyloid or not amyloid reaction. Lepiotas are dextrinoid, but another way you can tell is no vulva on the Lepiotas and a vulva on Amanitas. Agaricaceae, that big mushroom there in the left, is a big agaricus. Agaricaceae can look quite similar, big, chunky-looking mushroom, and a lot of times the gills are light before they start making spores. But once the spores get mature on a species of agaricus, of course, they're very dark color, almost black, chocolate color. Volvariella over there on the right look very much like Amanitas, but being in the Pluteaceae, they have pink spores. Again, the gills will look white when they're immature, and they have that vulva, so they look very much like an Amanita. But once the cap fully opens up and the spores start being produced, the gills will turn pink, and you can tell for sure. The one in the middle is a Lepiota, and in fact, it's probably the green gill. I think I took that picture in Florida where you'll see them in the wintertime after big drenching showers on lawns. They'll form big fairy rings. And again, you see it looks like a lot of other Lepiotas, has the white gills, but once they get really, really mature, the gills start turning kind of a sickly green color, because this is the one mushroom we have in North America with green spores. This is the so-called green gill, or Chlorophylla molybdites. Some books have them as Lepiota, or I think even Macrolepiota molybdites. So don't be confused with that. That causes a lot of poisonings each year as well. It's not deadly, but it's not too pleasant. Okay, so I mentioned these vulvas. Here's the different vulva types in Amanita. And this picture comes from David Aurora's tremendous book, Mushrooms Demystified. You can see they have on the far left there either a saccate or cupulate is also the term for that type of a vulva. Nice big kind of a boot on the base of the stem. They can have sort of a collar-like. It's very reduced and just forms a little collar. And we'll see this pointed out on Amanita pantherina. The one to the right of that is more of a Muscaria-like, where it's just sort of a ring or maybe 3 or so rings of scales at the base of the stem. And some of them really don't have much of anything. They have sort of an indistinct base of the stem. And of course, we'll see plenty of examples of that. So that's pretty much your different choices of what happens when you dig an Amanita out of the soil, what you can expect to find. Okay, so the two subgenera, Amanita and Lepidella, and so we'll start with the section Amanita, which has the type species for the group. So this will include Muscaria and things like that. That'll be really familiar to you. So you'll see some real pretty pictures here. Okay, section Amanita, pretty big group, 95 species worldwide. Characteristics are members usually have a prominent bulbous base with multiple rings. Almost all members lack a membranous or saccate or cupulate vulva. And they have a universal veil that's very fragile, or we call this friable or freeable. I've heard it pronounced both ways. And again, type species is Muscaria, and you see the symbol there that all the members in this group are considered to be toxic. I know some people eat some of them, and they can be detoxified, I think, by cooking. But according to this talk, I'm going to be telling you, you should be very cautious in eating any of these, or avoid them altogether. Okay, so the type species Amanita muscaria. This is flavivulvata. Picture from MicroWeb. You can see it's called flavivulvata. Flavi means yellow, so it has sort of a yellowing to the vulva, which you can see there on that ring. And it says an American native gone global. And the reason it says that is because Amanita muscaria, it's probably the European one, probably not the North American one. It has now gone to South America, Australia, pretty much all over the world. It's traveled with tree seedlings, and when growers have set up plantations of economically important trees, this has gone with the roots, and now it's even been spreading to other indigenous plants. So probably not destructive, but it very well could be out competing other native mycorrhizal fungi, I suppose. So here you go. The invasive species include some of our most beloved mushrooms. So what can you do? We have a number of different varieties of Amanita muscaria. The red one with the white patches, that of course is sort of like the poster child for all mushrooms. Back where I'm from, east of the Rockies, you almost never ever see it, unfortunately. I always like coming out to the west to see it because it's real pretty. The ones we have are more like this one, that what we usually call Amanita muscaria variety, Formosa. Formosa means beautiful, and this one is more of a yellow color and maybe orange in the center of the cap. The true name, I guess, is Amanita muscaria variety Gasellii, which is sort of the older name, and they think Formosa maybe is the only from Europe, but I still call it Amanita muscaria formosa, and everybody knows what we're talking about, so it's not a problem. It's usually more yellow than this. It's usually about this color. Can even be more of a white or even cream. There's a number of other varieties of Amanita muscaria. I stick this slide in here of my daughter when she was, a lot younger. She's 10 now, and she's really big into picking mushrooms. But I stick this in here because you'll see some names used that are currently being changed to reflect the fact that a lot of the names we have for mushrooms in North America are from European species, which we're starting to learn probably don't occur here, but have relatives that look very similar to them. So some of the names are being changed, and this is kind of frustrating for a lot of mycologists, amateur and academics alike. As mentioned at the outset, Dr. Rod Tullis, who's in New Jersey, he's pretty much the North American expert on the genus Amanita, and so he's sort of going to be changing some of our names. So Amanita muscaria at some point is going to be called Amara muscaria, I think is what he's going to do, and we'll see some other, throughout the talk, you'll see other Amanitas that are really common, you see all the time, and I'll note that their names are going to be changed, so if you keep referring to them by the old name, of course that's totally fine. But when someone says Muscaria, you're like, well, what the hell's that? That's something I've not seen before. Well, it's the same mushroom, but they're just changing the name. So there you go. Okay. Speaking of name changes, a lot of books call Amanita russuloides and Amanita gemata, which is shown here. This is actually russuloides shown here. They call these synonyms. And a long time ago, the famous American mycologist Charles Horton Peck actually pulled the two apart and said they were two different species based on some little characters he saw under the microscope and some other things. But so people decided, nah, they're the same mushroom. Well, it turns out Charles Horton Peck was right. If you do this KOH test on the cap, one species turns a bright yellow color and one doesn't. But anyways, so the group that contains Muscaria also has some pretty mushrooms like this. This is from the southeast. We'll see mushrooms, by the way, from all over North America. So I think it'd be kind of cool to see what you might find if you go foraging in other parts of North America. But for sure, you'll see a lot of mushrooms that are very familiar to you here in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. One of the prettier mushrooms in this group is this one, Amanita parsivolvata. It's the false Caesar's mushroom. I'm sure everyone's heard of Caesar's mushrooms, and we'll see those in a minute. They're in a different group. This is one called the false Caesar's mushroom. If you've picked it before, and I was just talking to someone who has, Caesar's mushroom has a cup underneath and is real pretty, and was that very first slide, the title slide. If you come upon this in the woods, and this is another fairly common one in the southeast, you'll say, Caesar's mushroom, you'll pick it, and you're in for a surprise because it's in the Muscaria group, so you shouldn't eat it. And notice on the bottom of the stem there, no cup. And it has just very few little patches on the top, but sometimes they wash off, which also would kind of trick you into thinking it's a Caesar's mushroom. So no saccate vulva, and it has another surprise too. If you check the gills, this was one that came in at the annual foray in Missouri. You see it does have a few little patches on it, and some people were perplexed, and it looks just like the one in the book. And the book said to turn it over and inspect the gills and give a sniff, and it has kind of a odd smell to it, but the gills are also kind of a yellow color. And you can see on this guy, this is Chris Crabtree from Missouri, you can see he has a little bit of the powder that kind of rubs off the gills and the stem onto his nose. So, like, yeah, the book's right, as usual. Some other species in this group, Amanita Wellsii, probably my favorite Amanita because it has a huge range. It's mycorrhizal with the genus Salix, and after the previous talk, you probably know what Salix is. It's the group of willows. So you can find Amanita Wellsii in the southeast, all the way down to Florida on different willow species. You can find it all the way up into the near Arctic conditions in Newfoundland, growing on different willow species there. On the west coast, they have this Amanita that's a close species, Amanita aprica, which is shown there in the inset. But they're both beautiful mushrooms, kind of a peach color with scales, and just a real gorgeous mushroom. As mentioned, this is a mycorrhizal with willow, and as you get farther and farther north in North America, the trees get smaller and smaller and smaller. And when you get up to Newfoundland, where it's nearly Arctic conditions, the salt spray coming off the coast and extreme cold and short growing season and everything makes all the trees grow really teensy. And in fact, some of the willows grow as these little kind of creeping plants that only get about an inch or two tall, and they creep along the soil in these little depressions called tuckamores where a lot of other trees occur. So this is one of the few places you can go in the world to see the mushroom and its tree host, the Salix uva ursi, the bearberry willow. And when both of them are together, it's really cool because the mushroom is taller than its tree host. It towers over it. So you can imagine if the trees here are actually like 60 feet tall and you're creeping around over them, imagine how monstrous this mushroom must seem to you in your ant-like size. The guy in the middle there is Andres Voigt. He's the big poobah of the Newfoundland Mycological Society and does their foray. And this is us looking for Amanita Wellsii. I was really excited to see it there. And the guy on the right, he's the Swedish ambassador to Canada, which was in for the big Linnaeus birthday celebration. So the whole weekend he's following all these mushroom crazies around, and he actually did have that question mark over his head the entire time. He's just like, what the heck? These guys are nuts. So just another picture of Wellsii. They get a little washed out there on the coast. If you find them more inland or, in Missouri or other parts of the country, they're a lot prettier because the sunlight and the salt spray and everything are not necessarily there beating on them. Okay, so another member of this group closely related to Muscaria is Pantherina, which looks quite a bit like it, only it's a little bit more brown color. You'll notice the scales are sort of gone on the stem, and it actually has this little collar. Michael Kuo, the guy that does mushroomexpert.com, another great website if you want to learn about mushrooms and see keys on how to identify them, etc. He always calls these little collars and things on amanitas and on morels and things little ant racetracks. So if an ant could fit in there and run around on the little racetrack, it's actually a true collar. So something to look for with the Pantherina. And I don't know if any Pantherinas came in. I'm sure some will come in. Fairly common mushroom. Okay, next group, the Vaginati. These have some really pretty specimens. They do have the cupulate vulva at the base of the stipe, often have a loose, fragile veil, may lack the partial veil, no bulb at the base, unlike the previous group, and also a pretty big group, 96 species worldwide, and all of the members of this group are considered to be edible, believe it or not. This is a real popular one on the West Coast, the grisette, Amanita vaginata. We have vaginatas, in the Midwest and other parts of the country. The weird thing about vaginata is, according to Rod Tullis, there's probably several species of Amanita that we call vaginata. So, if you tune in 10 or 20 years and pick up a field guide book, there'll probably be several different species teased out of this vaginata. This is the grisette, which is this kind of a real pretty gray-looking cap. There can be dark brown ones. I'll come back to this in just a second. There can be sort of more of a tawny ones. This is the tawny grisette, Amanita fulva, which is a more common form in the Midwest where I live. But you see they all have the same looking stem and this cupulate vulva on them. The cap has sort of these little ribs or striations on the margin. So those are good indicators of what you have. And Velosa, another relative. I was going to go back to this other one. There's a lot of uncertainties about Amanitas. There's still new species being named all the time, and if you want to make your mark in history, even as an amateur, you can find new species. This was a beautiful chocolate brown with white gills and white stem Amanita. It was like about at least 12 inches tall. That was found in Missouri at the annual foray a few years ago by my daughter, who was 7 at the time, and brought it in, and we were all puzzling over it. There's several really good experts at this event, Walt Sundberg and Michael Kuo and Jay Justice, people that to members of mycological societies, you'd probably recognize these names, and they know their mushrooms really well. We're all just dumbfounded because it looks like this real pretty grisette from the West called Amanita pachycolia, which I know a lot of people that eat. But pachycolia doesn't live east of the Rockies, so check in other books. There's some mention of this thing, Amanita umbrinolutea, in Bill Rudy's book to West Virginia, but no one had ever really heard of that, and that didn't seem like a very good name. So we sent the specimens off, took pictures and vouchered it, sent specimens off to Rod Tullis, and sure enough, the next year it was found again by some mycologists there. And so I was excited because I thought, wow, my daughter may have found like a new record for east of the Rockies, but as it turns out, it's actually a new species unknown to science. So it has the name of Amanita species T44 right now and is waiting to get a name. So even a little kid can find new species of mushrooms. Pretty cool. This is Velosa, another big edible Vaginati species from the West Coast. And this is Velosa, or so they thought, that was found at the Nama foray just 2 weeks ago over on the other side of Colorado. I know a lot of people that are here were over there. And if this first came in as Amanita velosa, which I thought was pretty cool, but I didn't know that it occurred outside the West Coast, so I thought that's pretty exciting. But then it was later taken off the tables, put back on the tables with a new name, which I was totally unfamiliar with, this Amanita barosii, but obviously it's fairly closely related to Velosa and some of the other members of the group. So that was a neat find because that was something that most people there had never seen before. Okay, next group. Section Caesarii, this includes the Caesar's mushrooms. There's several species of mushrooms that we call Caesar's mushrooms, and some of them look a little different from others. We'll see what I mean in a second. It says here the taxa assigned to this section previously were considered to belong to the Vaginati, and you'll see they look very similar. They have a cup and sort of a similar looking stipe, etc. But as it turns out, based on DNA studies, they're not really that closely related to them, but it doesn't really matter at all for this talk. There's 56 species worldwide. Type species is Amanita caesarea, which is a European species. The one that we used to call Caesaree in North America is now goes by its more correct and earlier name, Amanita jacksonii. I have plenty of pictures of that. It's a real pretty mushroom. Members of this section have a vulva at the base of the stipe, which I mentioned. The bulbous base is absent. So again, if you pull this out of its cup, the stem goes all the way down. It doesn't enlarge, and partial veil present. All the members of this group are considered to be edible, but again, you really need to know your mushrooms before you decide to start munching on any Amanitas. The Caesar's mushrooms, the true Caesar's mushroom from North America, Amanita jacksonii, formerly went by Caesarea. There's also some other species listed here, and I'll show you. There's some uncertainty on some of the names, but in any case, they're all called Caesar's mushrooms, and most look similar but have different colors. And some of them can get really big, and you can find large troops of them, and they are quite tasty. The Caesar's mushrooms are pretty subtle flavored, so this is one of the few cases where if you're going to eat it, you almost kind of have to eat them raw, and this is the way that the Italians really like to do it. They sort of make a salad, and I'll show you this dish, ovoli. Okay, so this gorgeous picture of this Caesar just coming up was by Noah Siegel, a real famous mushroom photographer from the Northeast. I mean, that's about as gorgeous as an organism gets, in my opinion. Some of the other ones are not entirely red or that kind of red-orange color. Some of them are yellow on the margin. The one from the Southeast, one of the so-called slender Caesar's mushrooms, this was given the name Amanita hemibatha, but turns out hemibatha was used for an Asian species of Amanita. So they've gone back to starting to use the old name, which is Amanita beningiana, which is named for a lady, Mary Banning, who was the first, I guess, to note this, to bring it to the attention of one of the mycologists that was naming species a long time ago. So hemibatha is beautiful, grows in the southeast, can get quite large, this big yellow, red looking cap. It's so pretty, we put it on the cover of Fungi magazine a few issues back, and just one of the prettiest mushrooms you'll ever encounter. As you can see, it's mycorrhizal with pine trees there. So this is the famous ovoli dish, one of the most famous mushroom dishes of all time, both because it's delicious, I've eaten it several times, and also because it has a tie-in with some world history, which will be the next slide. But if you do head to the southeast part of North America, where Caesar's mushrooms are much more common, you can find them around here, but much more common in the southeast. The way that the Italians fix this is they sort of slice up the mushroom. You see that on the plate there, sliced up raw, and they'll put some other sliced up raw vegetables on there, shave some Parmesan cheese, drizzle a little olive oil on there, and some salt, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's the smell and everything of the mushroom really comes out. So, but again, know your mushrooms, because famous people have eaten this and got the wrong Amanita, and it ended in disastrous results. And in fact, sort of the stuff of soap operas even, as we'll see. We have soap opera fans in the audience. You're in for a treat. So for this episode of As the Stomach Turns, we're going to be talking about the Caesar's mushroom, and we tune in to Claudius Caesar, who ascended the throne and took over after his nephew Caligula was assassinated. So already we have the trappings of a great soap opera. 8052, Claudius marries his fourth wife, Julia Agrippina, who, by the way, was also his niece, mycophobe and notoriously bad cook. And further backstory here, Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Empress Augusta Caesar, great-niece and adoptive granddaughter of Emperor Tiberius Caesar, and sister to Emperor Caligula. Wow, we thought we had soap operas in this country. AD 52, Agrippina, trying to please her new husband, tries cooking, ruins spaghetti. AD 53, Agrippina nags Claudius to adopt Nero, take out the trash, no more plundering, that sort of business. Claudius does adopt Nero, which now puts him in line for the throne, and this still did not appease Agrippina, so Claudius just goes into a tirade. They have a big fight in AD 54. Claudius says he regrets the adoption and doesn't want this adopted son that's not his own to become Caesar. When he passes on, he wants to go back to grooming his son, Britannicus, great name by the way, wants to go back to grooming Britannicus for the throne, so now Agrippina, worried, comes up with a plan. So she feigns that she's going to make up for him, cooking him his favorite dish of Wellsii, but unbeknownst to Caesar, it was tainted with Amanita phalloides, the death cap. AD 54, Claudius Caesar dies, clutching his chest, and his dying words were, "Realmente non potete cucinare," which means, "Your cooking is gonna be the death of me." AD 54, Nero ascends the throne, and the rest is history. And flash forward to today, many popular dishes named for Caesar, but not a single one named for Agrippina. So there you go. Know your mushrooms. Okay, back to some other Caesar mushrooms. This is another real pretty. This is pretty much all yellow species, also from the southeast. Amanita arkansana, another gorgeous-looking Caesar's mushroom, which again is edible. And as you can see, they can get pretty massive when they're coming out. And so this is Amanita. This has a number of synonymous names. Amanita calyptroderma and calyptrata is one that I know a lot of people use on the West Coast. It also goes by Amanita lanei or Amanita lanei. I've heard it pronounced both ways. This is the famous cocora, which has the great name, cocora, which translates in Italian to the pampered baby. Isn't that a great name for mushroom? Because it has sort of this little diaper on the top, and they're these kind of big chunky eggs. Pretty cool. Okay, so now we'll skip over to the other half of the Amanitas, the section Lepidella, and this has, or the subgenus Lepidella. This has a section Lepidella, Amidella, Phalloide, and Valide. And we'll sort of skim through a couple of these groups that don't really have very many species that you're likely to encounter, but the section Lepidella has some really big, monstrous, pretty white ones that I'll spend some time showing some slides of. They're really neat looking. So just as a reminder, the subgenus Amanita were the non-amyloid species, subgenus Lepidella were the amyloid spored species, just to keep your scorecard straight. Okay, section Lepidella, which means small scales. These are all real scaly, scurfy looking mushrooms, real pretty. Most of them white or almost entirely white. This is the most primitive group of Amanitas as well. Margin of the pileus always appendiculate, which means it's sort of tooth-like little remnants of the veil hanging down around the cap, and you'll see several examples of this. Other characteristics that are often present, flocculent or friable velar material, which is very delicate. Some of them it falls off as soon as the mushroom opens, so if you pick it and you don't see that, you could misidentify some species. So you want to look around on the ground. You'll often find the veil lying there on the ground. It'll just fall off. Non-persistent annulus, which also often falls off. It's very delicate. This section is notorious for having noticeable odor. Very stinky mushrooms in this group, especially if you're the type that likes to dry specimens on the dryer in your motel room overnight, and you wake up in the morning and the owner or your neighbor's banging on your door because this horrible stench of like fetid socks or spoiled meat is coming out of your room, and the dryers just really bring the smell out. Some of the other descriptors in field guide books are unpleasant, fetid, chlorine. To me, it smells like not really spoiled meat, but sort of old ham in some of the species, and old socks is used a lot. Most of these species are in the southeast. There is at least one species on the west coast and some around here. Very tough to ID because they're all white and sort of scurfy and shaggy looking. So it's sort of a tough group, but for sure you can identify species in this group from all the other Amanitas, and you wouldn't want to confuse them because most of these are considered to be poisonous. So, you know, you can tell them from the other Amanitas even though you may not know the exact species. And it's a big group, 164 species worldwide. Okay, so this is that appendiculate appearance around the margin of the cap. You see it kind of hangs down, can't miss it. And they look pretty warty and scruffy as well. A lot of them have great big long roots. You see this Amanita smithiana found in the Pacific Northwest. When people are looking for matsutake out there, the matsutake often just barely pops up through the duff on the floor, and very often mistake this mushroom. Once you pull it out of the ground, you wouldn't mistake it, but at first you could easily mistake it because you just see this little bit of white shaggy tuft sticking up through the leaf litter, and they get big and massive like a matsutake, so it's easy to confuse them. So just be forewarned. And then the other mushroom that this lady's holding, of course, is lobster mushroom, which are real common out there at the same time, and quite tasty. Okay, so it's tough to tell a lot of these apart in the Lepidella group, and most of them can get really massive. Unfortunately, I put them side by side for comparison on this slide, so it makes them look small, but don't be fooled, they can get quite giant. There's Amanita kokiri on the left. Notice the long rooting stem, so you really, if you suspect you have a Lepidella, you want to really try to dig down deep to get some of the rooting stem out of the ground. Compare that with Amanita abrupta, which is the abruptly bulbous Amanita. The base of the stem looks like a great big marshmallow almost at the base of the stem. Pretty funny looking thing, and also quite common in the southeast. Amanita polyparamus is quite common in the southeast as well. It gets really big, and a lot of the velar material on it's really, really delicate. I'll show another picture with this stuff all over the ground of this guy. Amanita dossipes, if you watch Gary Linkoff's Facebook page, he found some of these earlier in the year and was putting sequential photos day after day, brought them back in and stood them upright in a glass with, I think, some water and allowed them to open up. And they're really quite pretty, kind of brownish on top, and then they have this sort of a carrot-like root that's kind of brown-orange with cracks in it, and you can see the arrow pointing to it there, and that's how it gets the name dossipes, because that refers to sort of Docus carotis, the carrot. And it's another point to mention, if you want to dry these and save them because they're pretty or whatever, Amanitas have the weird ability to sort of keep growing after they've been plucked, and they have this negative geotropism, whereby when they're lying down flat on the table, after a couple days you'll see that the cap will turn upward and they'll get bent to them. So if you are like me and like to dry mushrooms for future viewing or just to sit around at the house because they're pretty and they're free, don't just dry them in the dryer or someplace on the counter like you normally would, boletes and other things. You want to stand them up or put them in foil or in a glass or something. Otherwise they'll take on this bent appearance and they won't look really very pretty. Amanita polyparamus, you can see all of the really delicate velar material on these guys. This is also from somewhere in the southeast, I think maybe Missouri. That's my daughter and I. This was taken by Ken Gilberg. Yeah, this is in Missouri. This is taken by Ken Gilberg of the Missouri Mycological Society. We found this gigantic fairy ring of these things. There were hundreds of them. They were all massive, and the widest part of the fairy ring, it was probably at least 100 feet across. It was just colossal in the forest, and that's obviously tough to take a photo of. But you didn't have to use your imagination to see the ring. It was a very complete ring all around the forest with just hundreds and hundreds of these guys. It was just amazing. Some of the small Lepidellas, they're not all big. Some of the small ones that occur in the southeast, like Anusta, the so-called gunpowder Amanita, because it's kind of got this dry silver gray powder that kind of rubs off the cap. It looks like gunpowder. It's a little bitty sucker and usually occurs in kind of sandy, disturbed, compacted soil. And then another one, probably closely related to Amanita pelioma, which has, underneath when you turn over, it doesn't have white gills. It's kind of a surprise. It has these cafe au lait, kind of a light chocolate brown color gill, which, you see that and you immediately think, well, not an Amanita, but surprise, it will have white spores and it is an Amanita, and there's another species or two that have brown gills, so something to watch out for. Then a couple of the big, deep-rooting Lepidellas, Amanita ravenellii, with these big sort of shingly warts on the cap. They can get massive as well over a foot tall, a foot across. Great big chunky root. And Amanita rhopalopus, the one on the right there, also doesn't have the shingly warts on the top, but also has this big, deep-rooting base. I mean, you'll spot these when you're driving down the road. They're so massive and can occur on people's lawns. They're really cool to see. They're just so big. Here's one that's probably moving north due to global warming. This is Amanita tiercii, named for hairy tears. This one doesn't have an odor, unlike most of the species in this group, and it's not mycorrhizal. So when you're out on a lawn, no trees for miles, and you see this big lepiota, and you start filling your basket because everybody knows lepiotas are tasty. Well, surprise, surprise, not all the Amanitas are mycorrhizal, so you don't have to have trees nearby. And this has led to a number of people being sort of confused about what they were finding. It was first noticed in more of the south part of the Midwest by Smith and Weber, and then in Kansas by Skip and Sherry Kay, who I was just visiting last week, and now it's continuing to move north. It's now in Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, and will probably be up in Wisconsin where I live before too long. So kind of a neat looking mushroom, very shaggy. When this was the guy who found this, and his mom gave him a shovel and said, "Dig that up. It looks, menacing. Dig that up and go take that to the mycologist across the street." So this is not my house, by the way. This is another picture at Ken Gilbert's house. You see the big concrete Muscaria just over the shoulder of this kid, which to me is frankly more menacing. Why someone would have that in their yard, but that's neither here nor there. So kid runs over. I guess there's now a hole in their yard, and what is this? And it's really cool when you turn this thing over. Its veil is real shaggy and cottony. I mean, you can't really mistake it. But it turns out it's Amanita tiercii, which is a gorgeous mushroom, and again, most common on lawns where there might not be any trees. Some mushrooms you for sure should know about. This is the section of Phalloideae. This includes the really, really, really deadly Amanita species, which some of these are now moving around to different parts of the country and causing some problems. So section of Phalloideae, you'll see margin of the cap not appendiculate. Annulus is present. The color of the pileus is white to very bright, but can be dull and even kind of almost greenish in the Phalloideae species. They contain a number of toxins that are deadly. Some of them have a slight odor, but it's sort of hard to put a finger on what you would call the odor. I know Amanita phalloides in David Aurora's book, he says it has an odor whereby it reeks of death. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it does have kind of an odd odor. Fairly large group with 47 species worldwide. Amanita phalloides, again, the common name is the death cap. You see it's moving around the country. It was first seen on the west coast. It's now on the east coast and has caused deaths there. I know last year, I think it was seen in the Denver area. It's been seen in the St. Louis area this year, I think, and sort of popping up in some other places. So it's getting around the country. You see the picture of it there. It's mostly white, but does have kind of a greenish cast to the cap, but not always, so it can be a little bit confusing. But should point out, of course, I get asked, is this edible? Is this edible? All mushrooms, of course, are edible, not necessarily palatable, and you might not be around to enjoy them a second time. So be careful of what you are eating. This was taken at the San Francisco Mushroom Fair, I think last year, where tons of these guys were coming in. So there's probably enough on that platter there to probably wipe out everyone at this festival. So be very careful of what you're eating. The so-called destroying angels, and there's a few species, are in this group as well. They're gorgeous mushrooms, snow white, often very tall, and a lot of the time you find just a single one by itself in the woods or even on a lawn. They're really striking. This year we had record rainfalls in Wisconsin, and we were seeing these everywhere. So it's a little confusing if you read the guidebooks, which species we have: Verosa, Bisporigera, Ocreata, Verna. Which ones do we have? Well, Verna is probably a name only good for European species. Obviously, closely related ones would be Verosa and Bisporigera. Ocreata is the one on the west coast. And you see there's a thing there how to tell these apart by this potassium hydroxide or KOH test. The true Verna of Europe is KOH negative. The other destroying angels are all positive and will turn bright yellow when you put KOH on the cap. What we thought was Verosa all the time turns out is probably mostly, if not exclusively, Bisporagira. And some of the guidebooks are now, you see this name. So how to tell Bisporagira? Well, as the name implies, it's two-spored, but it turns out not all the time. Sometimes it has 4 spores. If you were to look at a close-up of mushroom gills, of any of the mushrooms you've been bringing in, you'll see these club-shaped things called the basidia, and that's how the basidiomycetes get their name. They have these little horn-like projections called sterigma, and the spores are born on those. The spores are, packaged inside the basidia, and then the spores are at the tips of these little horns, and then when it's time, they are shot off the surface of the gill, and then, they're at the mercy of the winds to be disseminated around the world. Well, if you were to look closely at mushrooms, they don't always have the four spores and the 4 sterigma on these basidia. Some have 2, and in the case of Bisporagira, this is most often the case. With a lot of other mushrooms we have, that you're mostly going to see the 4 spores. But again, it's not always the case in Bisporagira, so you have to be a little careful. But in any case, it's best to avoid any mushroom that looks like the one up in the top left-hand corner, because the destroying angels are deadly. Okay, so we'll be finishing up here pretty soon. Just a few more things to show. This is section Velidae, margin of the cap not appendiculate, no membranous universal veil. Annuals is present. This group is really pretty. There's a number of really bright yellow and orange and even kind of brown yellow species, real pretty. Some, like the rubescens, which is a real common mushroom over most of North America, are eaten by people. But, again, with caution, because there's some other ones in the group that look pretty similar that are considered to be inedible. So watch it. Pretty big group, 76 species worldwide. Here's Amanita brunescens. A lot of these came into the Namaphore just a couple weeks ago. It's the one on the right. A close relative, Amanita citrina, which we see a lot in the Midwest, is on the left. Pretty much similar looking mushroom, but a different color cap. Rubescens, is someone sneaking up on me? Okay. Rubescens probably is a couple different species. The West Coast one seen here looks quite a bit different than the one I see all the time in the Midwest. But I know a lot of people that eat this mushroom. I've tried it. It's not especially tasty, but some people really swear by it. And mycorrhizal in the East anyway, with white pine and oak. It's a real common mushroom. It's called the blusher. You can see how it sort of has these little reddish patches on it. And that's natural. That's not from bruising or anything. Just a couple other species, real pretty. There's the Flavoconia, this real pretty yellow, usually with patches on the cap, and most of the time the stem is yellow, as you see here. Real pretty mushroom. And a relative Flavoconia, and Flavoconia and Flavorubescens look pretty similar, but depending on which guidebook you have, they often say that Flavoconia has the yellow stem and Flavorubescens does not. Flavorubescens has a little bit of a red blushing to the stem, as you can see in the picture there. But both are gorgeous mushrooms, real bright colors, and probably related to another western one, Amanita franchetii, seen here, which I saw quite a bit last year in January in California at the Santa Cruz Fest and around there. It was popping up everywhere. It was just, this picture doesn't even come close to doing justice. Just gorgeous gold and kind of bronze colors, real pretty with lots of patches on the cap. So with that, if anyone has any questions, if we have time, I'll be happy to. Otherwise, later on. Art says no questions. But you can find me. I'm right outside if you have any questions. So thanks for your time.
Well, wasn't that great? I personally love the whole genus, and it's really wonderful to be able to get a whole understanding of all the different kinds of species that are involved. Britt is obviously incredibly knowledgeable, and it's really wonderful to have him. And I really appreciate having Fungi as one of our sponsors. So another big hand for Britt Bunyard and Fungi Magazine.